The forbidden battlefield. The alien research team landed on the forgotten battlefield, their ship settling in a cloud of dust. The air was still, unnaturally silent, as if the land itself held its breath. Captain Selvor, leader of the Syrian archaeological unit, stepped onto the cracked ground, his eyes scanning the endless field of rusted weapons, broken armor, and motionless human bodies. "This place is strange," murmured Tyrakel, the team's energy specialist. Her scanner beeped erratically. "The energy readings are impossible. It's like something is still alive here." "Alive," scoffed Borgzan, the youngest scientist. "These humans died thousands of years ago. This is just an ancient war site." But something about the battlefield felt wrong. The human bodies, hundreds, maybe thousands, were still perfectly preserved. No decay, no signs of time taking its toll. It was as if they had fallen only yesterday. Captain Selvor frowned. "We proceed with caution. Gather data, take scans, but do not disturb anything." The team spread out, their equipment humming as they analyzed the ancient ruins. The battlefield stretched beyond the horizon, filled with massive craters and skeletal remains of war machines. Scorch marks from unknown weapons covered the ground. The sky above was dark and cloudy, though no storm was coming. Then, Tyrakel stopped suddenly. "Captain, I found something." She pointed to a stone monument in the center of the battlefield. It was large, cracked with age, but the inscription was still clear. The team gathered around as the translator device processed the text. Within seconds, the words appeared on their screens. "Do note this durbte Favelin warriors. Their war is not over. Those who await them shall face their wrath." A deep silence followed. The team exchanged uneasy glances. "That's ominous," Borgzan whispered. Selvor narrowed his eyes. He had studied many ancient civilizations, but no race had ever left a warning for the dead. This was different. This was unnatural. "Let's not take any chances," he ordered. "We collect data and leave." But Borgzan, ignoring the warning, had already stepped away from the group. He had found something interesting. A human warrior lying on his back, his armor still intact, a long blade resting across his chest. The warrior's face was peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. "This one, he looks different," Borgzan muttered. "So well preserved, so detailed." Curiosity got the better of him. He reached out and touched the warrior's armor. The moment his fingers made contact, a deep vibration shook the battlefield. A sudden gust of wind swept through the land, carrying a whisper that none of them could understand. The sky darkened further. Tyrakel's scanner flashed red, detecting a sudden energy spike. "Borgzan, step back," Selvor barked. But it was too late. The human warrior's eyes snapped open. Borgzan let out a gasp and stumbled backward. The warrior's eyes were not normal. They glowed an eerie white, as if a fire burned inside them. The ground trembled, and across the battlefield, hundreds of human bodies began to shift. Their fingers twitched, their weapons rattled. The air grew colder. Then came the first voice, deep, hollow, filled with a warning from beyond the grave. "You should not have come." A terrible, inhuman scream echoed through the land, and the dead began to rise. The awakening. The battlefield was silent no more. Borgzan's breath caught in his throat as he scrambled backward, his claws digging into the cracked earth. The human warrior he had touched, a man who had been dead for thousands of years, was now moving. His eyes, once lifeless, now glowed with an unnatural white light. Borgzan tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He turned to call for the others, but something far more terrifying caught his attention. Across the battlefield, the silence shattered. Armor rattled. Weapons shifted. Bodies moved. One by one, the fallen human warriors began to stir. The ground beneath the Syrian team pulsed with an invisible force. Tyrakel's scanner, still strapped to her arm, beeped violently. The readings made no sense. Energy levels are rising. But there's no source, no technology, no life signs, she shouted. Then what the hell is happening? Zelvor barked. Bor-Ixen tried to rise, but his legs felt numb. He was paralyzed, not by some unknown force, but by pure terror. The human warrior in front of him, the one he had disturbed, slowly sat up. His movements were slow, mechanical, but his presence was overwhelming. Then he spoke. "You should not have woken us." His voice was deep, echoing, as if it came from a place far beyond this world. Borgzan's heart pounded. We didn't mean to." The warrior turned his head slightly, and the air around him grew heavy. Borgzan's chest tightened, like an invisible force was pressing down on him. His breathing became ragged. Then, the warrior did something even more terrifying. He stood, not like a corpse brought back to life, not like a mindless monster. He stood like a soldier, like a warrior ready for battle. And he wasn't alone. A metallic clang echoed through the battlefield as hundreds of warriors picked up their weapons. Rusted swords, cracked shields, ancient rifles that should have turned to dust long ago. They stood side by side, just as they had in life. A forgotten army, awakened once more. Tyrakel took a step back. "Captain," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave. Now." But Zelvor didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the warriors. One of them, the first to rise, slowly turned his head toward the Xyrian team. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he raised his sword and pointed it directly at them. The message was clear. Run, or die. Zelvor snapped out of his daze. Everyone, back to the ship. Now, the team spun and ran. Their footsteps pounded against the dirt as they sprinted toward their vessel. Behind them, the sound of marching filled the air. The dead were moving. Then the first scream cut through the battlefield. Bor-Ixen dared to glance back, just once. He regretted it instantly. One of his team members, a soldier named Rizalin, had fallen behind. A warrior's hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing him by the throat. His body convulsed, eyes wide with terror, and then he was gone. Not dead, not torn apart, just gone, as if he had never existed at all. Bor-Ixen turned back around and ran faster. The Xyrians reached their ship, gasping, stumbling. The doors hissed open, and they hurled themselves inside. Zelvor slammed his fist onto the control panel. "Lift off. Get us out of here." Engines roared. Dust and debris swirled as the ship tore itself free from the cursed ground. But as they ascended, Tyrakel stared at the monitors, her hands trembling. "Captain," she whispered, "they're watching us." Zelvor turned to the screen. Through the thick battlefield fog, the warriors stood in formation, staring up at them. Unmoving, unwavering. And then, one of them smiled. The unstoppable force. The ship cut through the darkened sky, its engines roaring as the Xyrian team fled the cursed battlefield. Inside, the air was thick with panic. Bor-Ixen sat hunched in the corner, his claws digging into his arms. His breath was shallow, his mind replaying the last thing he had seen. The warriors rising, the silent stare, and that horrifying smile. Zelvor's voice cut through the chaos. "Status report." Tyrakel's hands trembled as she read the data on her screen. "We're clear of the atmosphere, but something's wrong. The ship feels thudy." The entire ship shuddered, as if something heavy had just landed on the hull. Silence. Then, thudy, thud, thud. Louder, closer. Borgzan's blood ran cold. That's not possible. Zelvor rushed to the external cameras. What he saw should not have been real. Outside, standing on the ship's hull, were the warriors. Hundreds of them. They should have been weightless in space. They should have been dead. But they stood as if the void meant nothing to them. Their ancient armor didn't crack. Their weapons didn't rust. Their glowing eyes stared directly at the crew inside. One of them, the first one to awaken, raised his sword. And then he swung. A deep metallic gash split through the ship's hull, as if his weapon could slice through reinforced titanium like paper. Alarms blared. Tyrakil's voice turned into a scream. "Hull breach. We're losing pressure." But Selvor wasn't listening. He was staring at the monitor, at the warrior who had just looked directly into the camera. And then he spoke. Even through the vacuum of space, the sound filled the ship, vibrating through every wall, every floor, every console. "You took our peace. The lights flickered. Now we take yours." The ship tilted violently, as if something massive had grabbed it from the outside. The force sent the crew flying. Borgsen crashed into the control panel. His vision blurred. The alarms were deafening. The emergency oxygen systems struggled to keep up. And then, the gravity vanished. Everything floated. The crew, the equipment, the shattered remains of their ship's interior. Tyrakil gasped, her body twisting in zero gravity. She tried to grab onto a railing, but something else grabbed her first. A hand. Cold. Strong. Not alive. Borgsen turned just in time to see her vanish, dragged into the darkness by an unseen force. "Tyrakil," he screamed. Zelvor's voice rang out. "We need to abandon ship. Get to the escape pods. Now." Borgsen barely managed to push himself toward the nearest pod. His claws scraped against the floor as he propelled forward, heart pounding. Behind him, the shadows moved. He didn't look back. He couldn't look back. One by one, his crewmates vanished into the dark. No screams. No blood. Just gone. The escape pod's door slid open. Borgsen lunged inside, slamming his hand onto the controls. The hatch sealed shut, and the pod launched into space. For a moment, all he could hear was his own frantic breathing. Then, through the pod's small window, he saw it. The ship, his ship, was gone. Not destroyed. Not floating debris. Just gone. As if it had never existed at all. His hand shook as he activated the distress beacon. "This is Borgsen, last survivor of the Syrian Archaeological Unit. Do not," his voice cracked, "do not approach Earth's battlefield. Do not wake them." His breathing slowed. His body trembled. And then the signal cut out. The distress beacon failed. And the last thing Borgsen saw, before everything went black, was a warrior's glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. The ghost war begins. Borgsen awoke to silence. His breathing was shallow, his body weightless. The escape pod drifted through the void, its control panels flickering weakly. The emergency oxygen system had stabilized, but his mind had not. His hands trembled as he checked the distress beacon. It was still dead. No signal. No ship. No one coming to save him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. The last thing he remembered was the warriors, the glowing eyes, the way they had stood in space like it meant nothing, the way his crewmates had simply vanished. Borgsen clenched his jaw. "It's not possible," he whispered. But the impossible had already happened. The pod's proximity alarm suddenly blared, making him flinch. The radar picked up a massive object directly ahead. Borgsen turned to the small window. His blood ran cold. A ship loomed in the darkness. Not his. Not any Syrian design. It was old, ancient, human, drifting, silent, waiting. He knew he shouldn't go near it. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away. But the pod's engines were failing. He had no choice. With shaky hands, he adjusted the controls. The pod drifted toward the massive vessel, its structure barely holding together. The closer he got, the more details he saw: jagged hull breaches, deep battle scars, markings burned into the metal. This ship had fought in a war that never truly ended. The pod docked with a weak clank. Borgzan's heart pounded as the airlock hissed open. A wave of cold air seeped inside, carrying the scent of rust and something else. Something ancient. Something dead. He stepped inside. The ship was in ruins, its hallways frozen in time. Helmets, shattered rifles, and human armor lay scattered across the floor. The walls bore deep claw marks, not from any known weapon. Borgzan's footsteps echoed too loudly. He felt like he was not alone. As he moved deeper, the emergency lights flickered weakly. He approached a terminal and wiped away a layer of dust. The screen struggled to power on, and then a video log played. Static. A distorted face. A human soldier, bloodied, breathing heavily. This message is a warning. To whoever finds this, we thought we could win. We thought the war would end. The soldier coughed. Something moved behind him. But some enemies don't stay dead. Some wars never end. Borgzan's chest tightened. He was inside a graveyard of warriors who had never truly fallen. A soft sound broke the silence. A footstep. Borgzan froze. He turned his head slowly and saw a shadow standing at the end of the hallway. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. A warrior. Still, silent, watching. The lights flickered, and then the figure moved. Borgzan ran. The hallway stretched endlessly, the air growing colder with every step. He could hear footsteps behind him, but never fast, always measured. The warriors didn't need to hurry. They knew he had nowhere to go. A voice, deep, hollow, and terrifyingly calm, echoed through the ship. "You disturbed our rest." Borgzan reached the airlock, slamming the controls. The doors hissed open. Too slow. He turned and saw the first warrior standing only inches away. A towering presence. Armor cracked but unbroken. Eyes glowing with the cold fire of something beyond death. The warrior raised his rusted sword. Borgzan's vision blurred. His body refused to move. This is how it ends. Then, a second voice. "Let him go." The warrior hesitated. For a moment, the ship itself seemed to pause. Borgzan gasped for air. Another figure stepped forward. This one looked different. Still human. Still dead. But less cruel. The first warrior turned his head slightly, considering. And then, without a word, he lowered his sword. Borgzan fell to his knees, gasping. His mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The second warrior stepped closer. "Go back. Tell them. Never return here." Borgzan didn't need to be told twice. He staggered into the pod and slammed the launch controls. The airlock sealed shut, and the pod blasted away. Through the window, he saw the warriors watching him leave. Silent, unmoving. And then, just like before, the ship vanished, as if it had never been there. Borgzan collapsed in his seat, shaking. He had survived. But deep down, he knew. This was not over. A desperate escape. Borgzan's escape pod floated in the vast emptiness of space, but he knew he was not alone. His breathing was shallow, his claws trembling as he pressed buttons on the control panel. The distress beacon was still dead. No way to call for help. No way to warn anyone. But that wasn't what terrified him most. Through the small window, he saw the battlefield below. Earth's cursed war zone. And standing there, watching him leave, was the ghostly army of human warriors, unmoving, unshaken, waiting. His stomach twisted. "They let me go," he whispered. "Why?" The answer came too soon. A flicker in the void, a distortion in space itself. Borgzan's vision blurred as a massive warship appeared from nowhere. It was not Syrian, not human, not anything he had ever seen before. The Korthan Empire, Borgzan's blood turned to ice. They had come. The Korthans were warlords, conquerors of galaxies. They had been watching the Xurians' mission, waiting for them to confirm the rumors about Earth's battlefield. Now that the Xurians had failed, the Korthans were here to claim it for themselves. A transmission cut through the silence. "Unknown vessel, identify yourself." Borgzan's throat was dry. His voice barely worked. This is Borgzan, last survivor of the Xurian team. You need to leave. You don't understand what's down there. A pause. Then, laughter. The dead? You fear the dead. The Korthan commander's voice was amused. We are not Xurians. We do not run from ghosts. Borgzan's claws dug into the control panel. You don't get it. They're not ghosts. They are warriors. And they are still fighting. Another pause. Then, good. Then we will give them a real war. Borgzan's heart sank. The Korthan warship descended toward Earth. They had just made the greatest mistake in the history of the universe. The first strike. The Korthan warship hovered over the battlefield, its weapons charging. Inside, Korthan warriors prepared for invasion. Thousands of elite soldiers, armed with plasma rifles and energy shields. They had crushed civilizations, conquered empires, destroyed entire worlds. They did not fear the dead. The commander grinned, watching from the bridge. Fire. A beam of energy erupted from the ship, striking the battlefield. The explosion was massive, the ground splitting apart in a storm of dust and fire. Silence followed. The smoke settled. Nothing moved. The commander smirked. See, Justa. The lights flickered. A whisper slithered through the ship's comms, though no one had spoken. You should not have come. The commander's smirk disappeared. Who said that? A metallic screech echoed through the ship as the temperature dropped instantly. Soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The energy shields flickered. Something was here. The commander turned to his officers. Report. One of them, pale and shaking, pointed at the main screen. The battlefield was no longer empty. They were standing. Thousands of human warriors, silent, motionless, weapons in hand, eyes glowing like stars in a black void. Then they moved. They charged. The commander's stomach twisted. Open fire. Korthan soldiers unleashed a storm of plasma fire. The battlefield erupted with explosions, energy blasts tearing through the ruins. But nothing fell. The warriors ran through the fire, through the smoke, through the blasts as if they weren't even there. Then they reached the first Korthan soldiers. And the screaming began. The commander's eyes widened in horror. The screens flickered, showing his warriors being pulled into the darkness. No blood, no bodies, just gone. A Korthan soldier turned, eyes wide. Commander, they don't die. The screen cut to static. Then, a voice, cold and final. You wanted war. Now you will never leave it. The ship's alarms blared. Something was inside. Something had already won. Borgzan watched from his escape pod, trembling. The Korthan warship, the most powerful in the sector, was falling apart. And the warriors, they were just getting started. No place to hide. The Korthan warship was dying. Inside his escape pod, Borgzan watched in horror as the mighty vessel, the same warship that had conquered entire planets, began to implode from within. Not from explosions, not from enemy fire, but from something else. Something inside. Something unstoppable. Borgzan's claws dug into his seat. The ship's scanners flickered with chaotic energy readings. The Korthan fleet had come here expecting a war. Instead, they had found something beyond war. Something they could not fight. And now, they were the ones being hunted. The first to fall. Inside the warship, the Korthan soldiers ran. They were trained killers, elite warriors, but nothing had prepared them for this. The halls darkened, the lights flickering as if reality itself was breaking apart. And then, the whispers began. Soft at first, then louder. Voices from nowhere, voices from the past. You disturbed our rest. You took our peace. Now we take yours. A Corthan soldier screamed, firing his plasma rifle at nothing. The bolts of energy vanished into the darkness as if they had been swallowed whole. Then something stepped out of the shadows. A human warrior. Armor cracked, eyes glowing with white fire. His sword, ancient, rusted, was sharper than any Corthan blade. The Corthan soldier fired directly at him. The warrior did not stop. The plasma rounds passed straight through him. And then, before the soldier could react, the warrior swung. The Corthan soldier vanished. No scream, no body, just gone. The remaining Corthans turned and ran, but there was nowhere to go. The ship was no longer theirs. The dead had taken it. The last stand. On the bridge, Commander Xaltor watched the horror unfold. His best warriors disappeared one by one. His ship, once a symbol of power, was now a tomb. He refused to accept it. "We are the Corthan Empire. We do not fear the dead," he roared. But even as he spoke, the temperature dropped. His breath turned to mist. And then, he felt it. A presence behind him. Slowly, his trembling hand reached for his weapon. He turned and froze. A warrior stood there. Tall, silent, his eyes glowing like distant stars. His voice was a whisper and a roar at the same time. Some wars never end. The commander tried to speak, tried to run, but before he could move, the warrior raised his blade, and everything turned to darkness. Borgzan's escape. Borgzan watched as the Corthan warship, once the most feared in the sector, simply disappeared. No explosion, no wreckage, just gone. As if it had never existed. His breathing was ragged. His mind struggled to understand. And then, his pod's communication system crackled to life. A voice filled the air. Not Corthan, not Syrian. Something older. Something dead. "We are finished here, but we are never gone." Borgzan's body went cold. He knew what they meant. The dead had returned to their rest. But one day, they would rise again. And next time, there would be no warning. The final judgment. Borgzan drifted in the vast emptiness of space, his escape pod silent. The battlefield below was still. The Corthan warship, gone. His crew, gone. His distress beacon, dead. And yet, he was still alive. Why? His claws trembled as he gripped the console. Every logical part of his mind told him that this shouldn't have been possible. The Corthans had been stronger, more advanced, more ruthless. But it hadn't mattered. Because the humans were something else entirely. Not alive, not dead. Something beyond both. His thoughts spiraled until a shadow moved outside his window. Borgzan's breath hitched. For a split second, he saw a figure standing in the void. Not floating. Standing. Armor cracked. Cape tattered. Eyes glowing with the fire of something eternal. It was him. The first warrior. The one he had awakened. Borgzan's throat went dry. He had seen this warrior rise. He had seen him lead an army of the fallen. Now he stood alone. Waiting. Watching. Borgzan's chest tightened. He didn't dare move. And then, the warrior raised his hand. The pod shuddered violently. Lights flickered. The glass of the window froze over. And then, the warrior spoke. His voice was a whisper in the void. "You have seen what you should not have." Borgzan's body went cold. I didn't mean to." "You have awakened something that should never have been disturbed." The pod's oxygen systems faltered. Borgzan gasped for breath. The warrior's eyes burned brighter. "But you will be the one to carry our warning." Borgzan's heart pounded. His hand shook as he reached for the comms. Nothing worked. He was completely powerless. And then, The warrior lowered his hand. The ship stabilized. Oxygen returned. The lights flickered back to life. Borixen collapsed to his knees, gasping. When he looked back at the window, the warrior was gone, but a message was left behind, etched into the ice on the glass. Words that sent a chill through Borgzen's very soul. Some warriors never die. Some wars never end. His breathing slowed. His mission was clear. He had been spared for one reason only: to warn the galaxy, to make sure no one ever returned. Because if they did, the dead would rise again. And this time, no one would be spared.